All right, we'll get started here in just a couple of minutes. Good to be back with everyone, seeing lots of familiar faces and familiar names on the Hangout here. So we'll get started here in a couple minutes. If you're not watching this live, generally what we do is we let people get logged in and start asking questions. So you may want to skip ahead. This usually could take 5 to 10 minutes to do. So if you're watching this not live, feel free to go ahead and jump ahead. And we'll go ahead and get started in a few minutes. So my normal setup is a little different. My son is home today, as I'm sure a lot of people have kids at home, so you may hear him in the background trying to get some attention. So we'll get started in just a couple minutes. And if you want to, please feel free to go ahead online and introduce yourself. Tell us who you are, where you're from. We'll go ahead and get started in a few minutes. We'll do some introductions, and also if you wanted to ask questions, feel free to enter those in the comments field, and we will go ahead and start going through some questions. We had a couple questions sent in advance. We'll get through those. I'll start taking some notes, and we'll get started here in a couple minutes. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm just going to do a quick audio test. Now, as I do this, we will have some, there's a bit of a delay in the system, so I just want to make sure. All right, seems like audio is okay. Let me know if the audio sounds bad. Okay, so we have New York City. We have Clay Ostwald. Good to have you online. Belgium, Russia, UK, Hungary. I saw Taylor from Pine Grove. Peru, Colombia. Okay, UK. We have Texas. Mission Viejo. Sorry, it's going to Nepal. Oh, that's great. I'm not sure if we had too many live people from Nepal, Chile. All right. Okay, I think Mark Roos is on. We have Croatia. All right, we have Arkansas, Israel. All right, so we have Ontario, Poland, Saudi Arabia, Minnesota, Cleveland. My name is Greg Ondo. I'm actually presenting from Alexandria, Virginia. So that's where I'm based out of. All right, Pennsylvania, we have Hamburg, France, Panama, Russia, Greece, India, Ukraine, France, Lebanon, Sweden, Egypt, Istanbul, York in the UK, South Africa, Turkey, London, Ethiopia, Pakistan, probably pronouncing it incorrectly, Sri Lanka. All right, Chicago, India. All right, Richmond, Virginia, not too far. All right, we have Greece, Sweden, Belgium, planet Earth. All right. So we'll wait just a couple minutes and we'll get some questions logged in. Feel free to go ahead and start asking some questions in the comments field. Okay, so big crowd today. Figure we might have a big crowd. All right, so Canada, Norway. So I see a question. I lost my e-licenser. What advice to me? So if you're logged in with your My Steinberg account, you can do a. There is a process online where they could perhaps restore your licenses. So they could do that and probably deactivate your other license, but there is a procedure online that you could follow. So if you just search on steinberg.net. All right, Tanzania. Okay, so we'll get started here in just a couple minutes, getting people logged in. And please feel free to go ahead in the comments field after you introduce yourself. Just, let us know what topics you want covered today. Okay, so seeing about the mono stereo button. Let's see. You see a question about liking to find a way to get markers in the MIDI window that currently doesn't do that. I know it's kind of under discussion, so I think we may see that in future versions. But I can show you a quick workaround. Okay, so we have a question on audio warp. We'll go through that. Okay, so a question on Vienna and kind of farming out systems. Okay, we'll just kind of collect some of the different questions here and we'll get started pretty soon. All right, so those of us just joining, we're going to get started here in a couple minutes, but we'll go ahead and start with, if you want to enter questions, we'll get some of those started. In just a couple minutes, you could enter those in the comments field. We'll try to get through as many questions as possible. We have a lot of people on a Hangout. Thanks for everyone for coming on out for the Hangout. All right, so I see some nice comments for being able to do this. So my travel schedule was a bit curtailed, as probably many people's have been recently. So we have more time, and we'll see some more tutorials coming as well. Okay, we'll wait just a couple more minutes, get people logged in. We still have more people logging in. Okay, and we'll get started with some of the questions. Okay, so I've seen a question from Stephen Fluharty. I probably pronounced that wrong, but how do I mix down to a thumbnail to post songs on YouTube? Is that a video thumbnail, or just if you could let me know what kind of thumbnail that is, perhaps in one of the comments. All right, we saw people logging in. Okay, we'll still have some people logging in. All right, so it's just copying over some questions. We'll get started here just about in our minute. Thanks for everyone's patience. We still have people logging in. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. We'll have more questions kind of come through. I copied over some, but we'll work our way through the list. So I had a question that was sent over to me, I think it's from Mark Roos, about how to set a minor key in the score editor. So if we wanted to just take a particular, just take a particular selection here. Let's go into, let's say, my score editor. And when we do this, we could see kind of different key signatures usually indicated. Just turn this lamp off. Often you could see it kind of indicated in one of the inspector areas. But if you wanted to, let's, like, if we see our keys here, we see these represented in major keys, and it's really, you could just kind of choose to do the relative minor of that particular key, so it doesn't really change the key signature per se. But another way of approaching this is you could just get a lot of the great scoring settings by double clicking just to the left, and this will open up your score settings, which you could also just kind of go to your score menu to settings. And here there's lots of the, you find a tremendous amount of the scoring capabilities directly here. So if you select the staff settings here, which is set to main, at this point you could just set your key and clef here. So if you're going to, let's say, the key of C minor, you could just kind of go up and down, and you could adjust the keys, and you could click kind of in this zone or use your mouse scroll wheel to set the number of flats and number of sharps within your notation editor. So even though you could say, this is E flat major, you could also say it's C minor. So if you wanted to do it directly from the key here, it would just set the number of flats and sharps. So if I come here, that's kind of what that particular key would do. But as soon as you come here, you could see that as you adjust your key signature, and again, go to your staff to main, and you could adjust different settings directly there, and you can see that's automatically reflected. And if you have a part that is set up for, maybe a trumpet part or brass part, so let's imagine that we had this part that was set up as brass. Let me just do a quick, I'll just do a quick split staff here. And if this was set up for brass and it was a different key, you could actually go to your staff settings. And even though we're in E flat major or C minor, we could just come directly to the main area here, and there's a display transpose, and you could actually pick, this will be for trumpet, and then that would automatically do the correct orchestral transposition for you for that particular instrument. So if you have to do for winds and brass instruments that need to be transposed, we could just double click directly here and under the main. There's a display transpose that you could set by semitone, or you could actually just pick the instrument, and that will set it based upon the main key that has been defined in, let's say, the piano part that we look at here. So that's how you could set up for major or minor keys. All right, so going back through some of the questions, let me just scroll up here. Okay, so we have a couple questions about, the future mono stereo button on tracks. So as we work with this, as we have mono tracks here, we could actually, as we have a mono track, this is a mono track, and this is probably being sent to our stereo output. So as we look at our stereo output, we could just simply come here and see. Now, there's different schools of thought whether you want to have, if it should be the same exact kind of scheme, like channel width for inserts or not. Currently in Cubase, it's not set up. It's set up to maintain the signal path, and a lot of people kind of get can get a little weirded out by this. And most of the time I find it's because people are trying to use all their plugins as inserts. So if I want it, and it's, makes total sense to have a, often, different effects that are both stereo and mono based on the same track. So if I wanted to have a compressor on this particular track, since it's a mono track, I probably don't want a stereo compressor. And some people run into the issue where they're like, okay, I want to just put a reverb on. And I see many people that put a reverb on and are using a reverb within a particular project. And when they do that, they want to, and often instead of using a send, they will have, 16 different reverb plugins all kind of set the same way. So if I put a stereo reverb on an insert, that would function as a mono insert, because that's what the channel width of the particular track is. And it's really not any harder to go to your sends and just right click here and say, let's add an effects channel send. So if I wanted a stereo delay, I could just come select my stereo delay and put it on a send level. So now what we could do is we could have multiple tracks going directly to this stereo delay, all with varying amounts via the send. So this is going out to the stereo delay, which is on an effects channel track, which is, the same in essence and functionality as putting it on a group track. So we could send directly to here. So it's one mouse click by a right mouse clicking, or, so you could do your stereo or 5.1 effects there. And if you wanted to adhere to the channel configurations, you could do it as an insert. Now, some people may feel that, it's a limit to have 8 sends, but you could have 8 sends per track, but they don't have to be the same 8 sends for every track. So my vocal could have 8 independent sends than my piano track. So it's really, in this way, people often wonder why they run out of CPU. And I see a lot of projects where people have 16 reverbs, the same reverb as inserts on every single track, in essence running 16 times the processor, as opposed to just running one reverb and using a send to blend the wet dry ratio between the reverb and the actual dry signal. So there's not a stereo mono switch per se. And I understand the reason why. It's not to say that, we've had discussions about this. I know I've had it with product planning team before, whether that would be a great option. And it's obviously a popular feature request that they're aware of. All right, so let's go through other questions. So we had a question about currently, like when we have a MIDI track and if we have markers, we may not see markers that correlate between the two. And if we have our lower zone editor open, which is kind of the default state, and is when we double click here, we could see all of our markers. And as we navigate in our timeline, if we click on this icon here, we could link the zoom settings between the editor and the project window for the MIDI editors. So if we wanted to navigate quickly to the next marker, this would automatically align. Now, some people ideally would want to see the markers directly here in the MIDI editor, and I know there's been discussions of being able to incorporate that, but it might be a little tricky as there can be 10 separate marker tracks in a Cubase project as well. What I've seen other people do is just kind of using the in-place editor. So if you kind of go right-click on a MIDI track, and if you don't know this, you could go to your track control settings, and this is kind of an underutilized. And then you'll see edit in place. So if we right-click and go to the track controls, I'm going to just move my in-place editing to visible status. Probably should be by default visible. And now you could just kind of click directly here and you could do MIDI editing directly on the project window, and you could navigate that particular track to be right under a marker track if you wanted to. So in a crutch, I know it's not ideal to have the marker track, reference, especially if you're in a standalone MIDI editor, but there are ways to kind of have that correlation between the two. Now, another question was asked, since we're kind of in this particular area of the program, was like, how do you double click and not have that event show up in the lower zone, but maybe in an actual editor? And if we go to your preferences, so under Windows, it's going to be in the edit menu, I believe. On a Mac, it'll be under Cubase. And if you go to editors, you can see this preference: double click opens editor in lower zone, or you can say double click opens editor in a window. So if I say opens editor in a window, I could now, as I double click on an event, we could double click and this would be in its own separate floating window. And this is kind of how it was previous to version 9, I think, is when that behavior kind of changed, when the lower zone editing concept was employed. So again, go to preferences, to editors, and then you could also have it where, when you open with the key command, it could go into a lower zone. If you double click, it goes into a separate window, or vice versa. So you could just choose that particular preference there to kind of have the behavior you want. I know a lot of people may have multiple monitors. They may want to double click and see that editor open full screen on a separate window. You could do that very easily once that is set. All right. So next question we had, is there a way to audio warp multiple tracks like drums? One method for drums, we have kind of audio warp for one single element on the project window, but there are some ways of kind of approaching the same concept with drums. So if I wanted to have some drums, let me just open up a different project. Okay, let me just get something set up here real quick. Hang on. All right, sorry about that. All right. So let's say if I have my drums and I maybe wanted to tighten drums up. So let's say if I just soloed my drums and I had the click going on. And we often see this kind of with, so we could see this often with wanting to tighten up drums. So what I could do is we could put all of our drums into a group folder. So as I select my drums, we can now have all of the different drum tracks selected and kind of edit it together. So as we do this, we can come over here to our quantized setup. So if we just we can see our quantized setup here. And what we want to do is to kind of define different hit points, because a lot of times as we do this, if we listen to the drums with a click, it may not be as tight as we would. So you see that like the drum roll was a little bit off with a click. And maybe that snare fill was a little fast. And we could assign priorities to different drum sounds. So I'm going to take my snare and let's do perhaps our hi-hat. And we could kind of set different priorities to these. And what we want to do first is to actually, go through and define kind of our hit points. So I will just, maybe before we actually do the group editing, I will just come here to the hit points and we'll find kind of our hit points by turning this on here. So, and what we want to do is to basically kind of isolate, some of the tracks that are bleeding through. So again, let's find our hit points for our snare track. So as we do this, we'll set our threshold so that we're not having the hi-hats bleeding through, and we'll do the same for our hi-hat. So here we can see like the kicks bleeding through. So again, we'll just adjust the threshold and we'll just now have the hi-hat. So now once we and often depending on the material, like kick, hat are, good choices. So now, kick, hat, and snare. So we'll come over here to our quantized settings. And as we do this, we'll have our kick, our snare top, and our hi-hat set up. So once we do this, we could choose to automatically slice based on the material here. And that's created hundreds of little slices within the audio. And at this point, we could choose our different grid values. So we could choose to do 16th notes, and we could put a little bit of swing in if we wanted to. But at this point, we could choose to quantize, which would basically, if we do this, let's say I quantize the notes, it'll just kind of shift all of those notes, but it could leave gaps. Now, at this point, we could also choose to audio warp these. And audio warping, instead of kind of slicing and moving, will kind of just stretch the events to match. So if I wanted to just undo that, we could choose to audio warp the events. And then at this point, we could choose to quantize based on that. And so it's going to do a tremendous amount of math, taking each of those little snippets and we'll just quantize based on that. Let's see if maybe my Mac didn't like that. So, but at this point, you could just simply, choose to crossfade, and, if you did the slicing method, you could choose to crossfade. So let's give it a second here, see if my Mac will wake up. But this is a method that you could use. So once we've done that, it'll now just simply kind of stretch the different events. And then if needed, you could just choose to kind of do the crossfade. So that's a way that you could do kind of a multi-track warping for drums. So different material may really call for whether you want to kind of slice and quantize or do audio warping. It's not as ideal as, I know some other programs will allow you to do it on the main project window for multiple events, but if you're doing drums, which was what was asked, that's a great method for working with it. All right, next question. Is Vienna Ensemble Pro the only way to link multiple computers for DAW and sample libraries to help with system resources? No, it's not. We have a lot of composers still use VST System Link, which is kind of an older method that will allow you to, through like a digital audio connection, like a SPDIF connection between two different computers, that you could send 256 MIDI channels as well as a number and send the audio back and forth between the audio computers. Many people will just kind of do it manually and, send out MIDI to another computer and have the audio of that summed and then send it back in. A lot of people use VE Pro, for offline hosting, but, there's other kind of methods that work as well. So there's, multiple solutions for that, and many samplers, I think Contact or Hallian will also work standalone. So people will use those in the sample libraries, the sampler on a dedicated machine, and send MIDI to it, via a standard MIDI cable or USB, or even MIDI over LAN. So there's a number of different options available there. All right, so we had a question about in the drum editor, is there a way to select upbeats in a drum MIDI editor? So let's give it a quick look. I'll do a new project here. So I'll just add a quick instrument track, and we'll run it out to Groove Agent SE. Okay, and I'll just load a quick kit. Okay, so I'll go ahead and have it create the drum map from the instrument, and we'll create kind of just a quick blank part. All right, so let's say I will put in eighth notes. Okay, so there's a couple of ways, I think, through like the project or from the logical editor. So one method would be, I haven't done this in a long time, so I'll probably mess up. But we could choose to select type as event equal to note, and then we could say our position, and let's say inside bar range. So here you could probably just say I want it to have and we'll just choose inside bar range for all these and see if this does a trick. right, let me just see. So you could do something like this, I believe, that would do it. Another method, and I could play with this a little more offline just to make that probably a little more accurate, but you could kind of set the bar range. Another method that you could take, especially if you have like notes, and I think you could actually see this on my logical editor tutorial, and I don't have all of my presets from my previous computer, but let's say if we're going to set but there is a way to have it where you could do like every other note. And I know I kind of did that. Let me just. All right, so let's just see. So if you do something kind of like this, and again, if you watch the on the Q&A videos on the logical editor, it's one of the settings I set up. But basically, you can say, select every other note for, but I don't think I have this configured right. But there's a way, and if you look at that video, it kind of goes through it. But there are ways of setting it to select notes within a particular range or within like every other note. So if you have like a range of 8th notes or 16th notes, you could have that kind of configured in the logical editor. All right, let's go through some more questions. Thanks everyone for great questions and for patience. Okay. Okay, so a question, and again, revolving around VE Pro. So it says, when working on MIDI with VE Pro 7, 7 instances, is it better to work with higher buffer size? Probably if you're doing a significant, if you're running that many instances of VE Pro 7, depending upon your system, if you have like, a screaming computer, you could probably get by with lower buffer sizes, but higher buffer sizes generally will always make the computer easier and be able to run more. Some systems will be designed to run at particular buffer sizes and to be optimized. I don't work with VE Pro personally, so I'm not as familiar with it, but generally, as long as the buffer is okay for your playing, you should be fine. So, and that would make your system overall more stable to work with. Okay, question is, what's the easiest way to render audio from a group track? Okay, let's just jump back to our project here. So let's say I just have my drums set up. I'll activate this project. And I will, let's say, revert. All right, so as we look at this, let's see if I have all of my drums currently. So I want to set all of my drums here to route out to a particular group channel. So I'll just select these tracks here. And those are all my drum tracks. And I'm going to right click on the fader, and we're going to say add group channel to selected channels. We'll choose to keep it outside of the folder, which will place it just to the right of the selected channel. And now I'll just add stereo. So I'll just come here. We'll see our group track will be created here. And we could call this group track whatever we want. So we'll just call it a quick drum bus. And the question is, how do we render that? So if you just go to your export audio mixdown, we could say, okay, we wanted to just take our group channels. And then, we could just say at this point, I want to create an audio track from it. And then I could just choose to export the audio. We'll just call it, drum bus. And then this will just take all the drums that are being routed out to that particular group. And now it'll just kind of render that particular file for us. And it's going to place it back into the audio track of the project. So hit OK. And then this is all of our drums. So that's, it's maybe not analogous to other methodology like freezing, but again, it's that particular group doesn't have any audio in it. It's just kind of processing the audio. So again, you could go to your file menu, export, and then you just do your audio mix down, and you could just choose your drum bus. And you could do that, as a multiple. So if you wanted to do a batch export, but you could just simply do your drum bus, and on after export, just click create audio track. And then when we come right here, and it'll just listen to it. So there's our drum bus, and we could move it up, directly underneath our drums if you wanted to. So if you wanted to process it or do parallel processing, you could do that as well. Okay, so let's go through. All right, so I know kind of with the current situation that people want to see about VST Connect. I am working on a tutorial. I know it's kind of timely, but if you go to your VST Cloud, and I was messing around with it yesterday, to do this, what you want to do is, let's say, and it's pretty simplified, and VST Connect is going to allow you to remotely collaborate with people. So people could get an iPad app and be able to record with that, and or get a free download of the VST Connect Performer software, and that's what kind of the user would use. So if I go to my audio connections, let's say I'll just go ahead and delete a couple of things. I'll go ahead and remove my talkback, and I'll remove what they call the cues. So just kind of show you the process here. So when I go to my VST Cloud, we can go to our VST Connect SE, and I'm just going to say you have the SE version that comes with Cubase, which will allow you to do 2 tracks of audio. And there's also a Pro version where you could do 16 tracks of audio, full resolution, and have MIDI tracks. But we could do 2 tracks of audio free. So I'll come here and say, let's create a VST Connect. It'll ask us to choose a device port for TalkBack. So we'll choose our UR24C. I hit OK. And then it's going to automatically create our cue mix for us. We can sign in to with your My Steinberg credentials. So as soon as we'll just kind of come right over here. Now I'm logged in. You could find different users. You could also find friends that you routinely work with. And then once it's done that process, it's automatically created a audio track that's been routed. Now, one of the keys is that you want to, at this point, make sure that in the full mix console view, so we'll just navigate right over here, that you could go to the cue mixes. And if you don't see the cue mixes, we could just kind of go to your racks and make sure that the cue sends are enabled. And at this point, I could take all of my audio tracks. So let's select all of these. So select right there. And then I'm going to enable my quick link. And what I want to do is to just turn on all of my, turn on, and let's set the amount of the this end. And I'm going to just open up my right zone to have my control room here. So we could go directly to our Q mixes. And at this point, I could just say, let's use the current mix levels of the project. And that will automatically feed that directly out. Now within our VST Connect, so let's say if we just wanted to go back to the VST Connect, we could open the editor again. We would see them on. So just close this out really quickly. So as soon as we, have that kind of configured, you could see them on a webcam, so you could actually choose to communicate with them. And then, again, once you're kind of logged in, all you'd have to do is, simply, you could see if you have communication, and you may have to do some adjust port forwarding on the router, but you're able to record that person remotely directly into your system. I'm kind of now finally have set up in my studio where I have a wired connection, and it's best to have a wired connection. That gives you kind of more stability and has less fluctuations. So that being on a wired connection helps tremendously with this. But once you kind of have chosen your friend, at this point we will be able to see them connect. You hit record. The mix that you've created in the mix console through the control room and the cues is sent to them. They could record, and their audio files recorded directly back into your system. So we will. I know it's kind of a very timely and pertinent thing. So we are working on kind of a tutorial to kind of walk through everyone through this in more detailed and show an actual example. It's hard to show during a hangout for with sharing screens and doing the live connection as is, but we'll try to have a tutorial up soon with that. So okay, so let's go through some more questions. Thanks again for all the great questions from everyone. Okay, so just reading through comments and questions. I hope everyone's learning a couple of things. Okay, so we see Mark's question. Good to see you on the Hangout, Mark. All right. Okay, so we have a question on when I drag MIDI clips from Superior Drummer 3 into Drum Track. Cubase 10.5 always creates a new track at the bottom and puts the clip there. Why doesn't it just put it on the lane I drag it to? This is really dependent upon a preference. So it's an easy fix. So if you have different drum programs or different virtual instruments or MIDI files that you drag in. So if you go to preferences, and again, it could be under the edit menu on Windows or the Cubase menu on a Mac OS. We could now just go to MIDI files, and it says import options. It'll probably default to on destination. Just simply choose MIDI tracks. And then when you drag in or instrument tracks, you could just simply drag it to a particular track. Otherwise, if you do Hallian Sonic SE multi-timbral, when you drag that in, it will create kind of a standard MIDI file that will play back through a general MIDI map, which is how a lot of standard MIDI files work. So just simply change that preference. So again, go to your preferences and under MIDI file, the destination, adjust that to MIDI tracks or instrument tracks, and then you could drag it to your Superior 3 track, and all should be good. All right, so let's go through more questions. Thanks everyone for questions. Okay. Okay, so we have, is it possible to get the triplet groove as guidelines in Audio Manager? So let me just reread this. Okay, so I guess this might be referring to maybe on our project window here. So let's see. So I'll just go ahead and let's say I add a signature track here. I assume that this might be about maybe having a triplet as a triplet feel as a reference, like a visual reference. So if we come here, let's say we have our signature track, and it'll probably be set to 4/4 by default. So let's say if I just wanted to set this to 6/8, and let me just okay, so, and I think now if we just come here, I have my click pattern set to 6/8, even though we're in 4/4 time. And if you go directly to our, and right click on the main timeline, there's an option for use metronome click pattern level for grid line emphasis. So now as we do this, you can see the grid lines change. So if I wanted to put it to bars and beats, we can see our grid lines here change to every single beat. But now if I use the metronome click pattern, we could see it change to divisions for 6/8, where you could see kind of the display grid here in the background change to accommodate. So even though you're in 4/4 time, you could change the click pattern, and you could just double click here and change the click pattern. There's one of those that is a preset for 6/8. So once that's been altered, so if I just wanted to have this, and let's say we wanted this to be our straight 4/4 default pattern, we can see kind of the grid lines change based on that. So try setting it up, your metronome click pattern, and even to 6, and make sure that you have the metronome grid line for the grid line emphasis. So try that, and I think that'll help you with that. Okay, so see the question about double clicking a MIDI track, having it open into a separate window, which we covered a little bit earlier. Okay, so question on best way to integrate hardware, synths, and effects, audio MIDI. Thanks. Okay, so a great way, depending on MIDI information is very easy to set up. So if we go to your studio setup, you could have, and once you go to your MIDI port setup, you could have any number of different devices that are connected. So all of your MIDI interfaces will show up here. You could connect your hardware outboard gear or, your hardware MIDI devices directly to your settings. Once we have a MIDI track that's configured, we can now just come here and say, this is my, it's going to this MIDI channel on this port. A lot of newer keyboards will obviously have a USB connection and can transmit MIDI, multiple ports over USB. So you're able to do that quite easily. But you could also use MIDI interfaces. Like I have 2 older Mid-X8s that I still use, and for all of my outboard MIDI equipment for communication, so we could set that up. Now, with this, realize that sometimes while it could send MIDI information to and from the device if configured, you still may need like an audio mixer to actually hear the device, because it's going to send MIDI to the hardware, and the hardware itself generates the sound from the MIDI that is then going to be heard and, is hopefully our music that we anticipate. So a lot of people assume that, the MIDI's, the USB connection on some devices also carries the audio, and that's fine if you don't have another audio interface. But with most systems, you could have one audio interface, and, because there's issues with clocking. So many people will take, if you have a lot of outboard gear, will take the audio outputs from their MIDI devices and send that into a mixer and sum that mixer, and then be able to record that to 2 inputs on your audio interface. So if you just have 1 or 2 devices and you have an audio interface with additional inputs, this is where we could go to your studio setup, and you could go to external instruments. So let's say I was lucky and I just got a new keyboard. Let's say I was cool and I worked hard for Yamaha and I was able to buy a Montage. I could just simply connect the audio outputs of my Montage into my audio interface. And at that point, I have these being used for other devices in my controller, my TalkBack. And now when I go to add a particular instrument, I could kind of treat this much like a VST. So when I go to my VST instruments, I could add an instrument rack. We would see external plugins, and I could just now have my Montage, and we could create this, and we have our return level. Now, this gives us the benefit of being able to, once we have this set up, that we could run this through the same EQ and the same effects in Cubase as well. So if you have a lot of different devices, you could feed them into multiple inputs on your audio interface as external instruments. A lot of times, having a sub mixer is less expensive than having a lot of additional inputs. So the MIDI is really easy to set up. If you have like 1 or 2 keyboards, which is pretty typical for a lot of people's workflows these days, because we have such multi-timbral capabilities, that we could set up external instruments, taking the audio outputs of that particular instrument to the inputs of your audio interface, and then kind of bring it into your software DAW world. Now, we could do a similar process for our studio connections. So if I wanted to go directly to my audio connections again for like external effects, if I have a favorite compressor, I could just say, okay, let's say I wanted to use my LA2A, and let's say this will be a mono in and mono out. So at this point, we could now choose to take our, let's say I'll just have this particular track And when we go to inserts, we could see external plugins, and this could be routed out to our LA2A. And then when we come here, we could actually see this little ping option. So because we're going to be going in and out of the external effects to send a signal as opposed to just in, we could ping the system, and that will measure the latency of that signal path and automatically compensate for your different effects. So if you have one or two MIDI devices, depending on your, depending upon, not necessarily one or two MIDI devices, but depending on your available inputs and outputs of your interface, it's very handy to be able to use external effects or external instruments. If you have a lot of devices, many people will still sum all of the audio outputs of their external MIDI gear into a mixer and then have a stereo out of the mixer going in that they could print to audio to have it all kind of married together in the end. And even if you have an external instrument, you could choose to do typical stuff like render in place. It would just happen in real time. So the same with external effects and external instruments. So those are different ways if you're kind of working in a console-less, or without a console in your environment that you could work with. So, all right. I'm going to go read through a couple of different messages here. All right. So we'll move on. Thanks again for everyone's great questions. Okay, so we see, is there a way to, let me just scroll back. Is there a way to align audio that wasn't recorded with a click track in Cubase Elements 10.5? So we see, I'm not sure if this is in Elements. There's a couple of different ways. One is, let me just see if I have... Okay, so I'm in the pro version, and there's a couple ways that you could try in Elements. In Pro, it's very easy to, one method is, if we have, let's say, just a little bit of, and let's say it's not quite aligned to the click. And I don't believe that this is going to be in the Elements version, but we'll show this for the benefit of other people. But if you go to the tempo detection under, I think it's under project. So I'm going to select a file and go to tempo detection. We could do kind of an automatic analysis of this. So as we do this, so now you could do, so it's made a tempo map for you automatically. So, and at this point you could choose, where exactly your, didn't like that. So sorry about that. So you could choose where it will, let's get us restarted here. You could choose exactly, like where you want the downbeat to start. So we'll just get this going. But if you have a particular file, I'll just import the same audio file here real quick. Another method for doing this kind of manually would be just to use, and I'm not sure if this is in the Elements version, is a time warp tool. So once we kind of come here, you can just simply kind of listen to the music and say, this is where measure 2 starts. And this is where measure 3 is. And basically what we could do is manually move the bars to match up the audio events. So you could have kind of automatic tempo detection or kind of manually doing it with the time warp tool. But I'm not sure if those are in the Elements version. But see if the time warp tool may be. There's a chance that it might be, but I don't think that the tempo detection from the project menu is. But what some people will also do is just simply do a MIDI recording. So let's say if I just have a MIDI track here, and I'll just place this into record. And I'll just kind of tap along. And then I think if we go to the MIDI menu, you could choose, this could be under functions, merge tempo from tapping. And we could say our tapping was, set to quarter notes. And then you could make a tempo map kind of from that. So that might be in the Elements version. So again, once you kind of just tap along, and you could place MIDI notes exactly, if you want to be really precise. And under functions, just come here and say merge tempo from tapping. So, all right, just kind of going through. Thanks for all the great questions again. So let's come over here and we'll scroll through. Okay, so I see a request on updated tutorial on a control room. I think that the control room tutorial from Cubase 7 that I did, if you look for the Cubase 7 launch or the mix console, there's one that's dedicated to the control room there that's still applicable, but I'll see if it needs to be updated. It probably does, and some slight cosmetic changes. Okay, so just going through some more questions. All right, Paul Brown, just happy that we're doing a hangout today. So glad to be here, Paul. So congratulations on your Grammy. Okay, so question from Taylor. Good to see you on a hangout, Taylor. Says, can a 5.1 mix be done using quad headphones plugged into both headphone jacks of a UR44? Well, 5.1 first is going to be, for 6 channels. So it could be very critical to have your center channel where you're going to hear 4 channels. So it would probably, it wouldn't be an ideal situation. You could, if your headphone is set up for surround sound, like if it's a quad headphone, it's in, I've heard some like really, really expensive ones that are quite good, and some like, insanely cheap game ones that are, really good for kind of doing, panning binaural audio around. You could definitely, output the 4 channels, but I wouldn't probably do any mixing that way. If you had to use it as a quick reference for, listening to your 5.1, and, you couldn't afford speakers, additional sets of speakers, it could work. It's not ideal by any means, and so much of it could be based on. I know a lot of film composers kind of will compose in, quadraphonic, because they don't want to get into the center channel at all to interfere with dialogue. But it would, it would work, but I'm not sure if it would give you a true surround perspective, unless the headphones were kind of really designed for that and not necessarily for gaming stuff. But you could give it a try and see how it works for you. Okay, so we have a question. I have a problem with reinstalling Hallian and PadShop Cubase 10.5. It doesn't show up in the Steinberg Library Manager. So a lot of times when I've seen people run into this is like if you... all right, so I'm just going to reread to make sure I understand. So sometimes I've seen this happen where people download the program but don't necessarily download the full content of the installer. I know it's big. It's like 20 gigabytes big for the full installer. But, make sure that your download link is the same size. I know some people will, will be able to install the program without the full installer, but maybe not necessarily the content. There is the Steinberg Library Manager, which is a program, but that's kind of more geared toward the content for those particular instruments as opposed to the instruments. So, if you go to your applications, you could see the Steinberg Library Manager here. And once you open this, you could see kind of all the different content for those particular libraries. But make sure that you have the full content downloaded. And usually when I see a question like that, it's kind of indicative that it wasn't a full install and the download wasn't fully, downloaded and installed. But go ahead and try that and see if that does the trick for you. Okay, so we'll move on. Thanks again, everyone, for great questions. Okay, so we had a question on some tips on the score editor. So let's jump back to project here. All right. My son is getting a little restless upstairs. Sorry about that. You may hear him through the microphone. He's been cooped up, so... And we may get invaded here soon by my son, so I'll apologize in advance. All right, so a couple quick things on score editor. A lot of people, when they go to a part, they look at a MIDI editor like this, and then, maybe it's not played perfectly on the beat, which is very typical, and you may not want to necessarily quantize your different parts. So if we go to our score editor, one of the things that's, really helpful to do is, when you come over here to the settings, go to, it'll default to the staff, go to the main area, define the key of the song. But, one of the very important things to do. All right. Thank you, Ryan. All right. Sorry for my son. All right. Is just to have the quantize settings here. So you could have a display quantize. So if we wanted to come here, you may get a lot of stuff that looks like this. And technically this is correct as it was played. People will play ahead of the beat, and if it's a piano part, go to the polyphonic and just simply choose a split staff. But here I can say the smallest note that I intended to play was an eighth note, and the smallest rest I intended was a quarter note. And generally, I will uncheck those and check all of these. And just by kind of doing that, I'm not actually changing the rhythmic timing or positioning of the notation, but I'm doing a quantization on not the rhythmic aspect, but the display. So we do that, and now that's much easier to read. So that is a great way to kind of start with your score editor. So again, to get that, kind of go to your page mode. And at this point, you could also, I wanted to select all the notes in my score editor. For doing lead sheets, you could just say make chord symbols, and that will automatically place the chord symbols, directly in the project as well. So those are some really handy things to do with the score editor. But play around with the staff settings and the display quantize. And once you define kind of what your smallest intended rest or note were to be, at that point, you can get a pretty, a really good looking score quickly without, spending, creating a whole separate part that, feels terrible but looks good. So this way you could have the part look good and kind of feel musically good as well. Okay. So we had a question on side chaining. Okay, so let's say I think I have a project that's well set up for this. Okay, so one of the things that was improved in version 10 was the ability to do kind of creative side chaining. So if we want to come here, let's say I have a kick drum and a synth, and I'll make sure I don't kill you volume wise. So as we come here, we'll just set this up real quick so you could hear. Okay, so what you could do with side chaining is so let's say I wanted to side chain. A very common use of this is I want to take the bass and have it side chain based off of the kick drum. So I could go directly to this particular instrument here. And on my, let's say I activate a compressor. So at this point, I could just turn on the side chain, and we see that directly, usually in the top center. So you could see the side chain. And at this point, from here, one of the things that was simplified in version 10 was the capability of just adding our side chain input. So now I'll just say, let's have our kick. So now when the kick comes in, we'll have the bass, the synth of the bass. Do side chaining. Now you could also do some other kind of creative side chaining. One tutorial that was just released today on the Cubase YouTube channel was about doing side chaining for noise gates. So let's say if I had a drum loop, so let me just find a quick. All right, so let's say if I drop this particular, I'll just drop this file in. Okay, and we'll have that put to musical mode. So now what I want to do is see, I could choose to have a noise gate. Let's just turn this off. And let's say if I go to this particular channel, I could go to my channel strip and we could have our noise gate. And we could have a side chain on a noise gate if we want. So as we do this, and now I want this particular track to feed the noise gate. So that way you could do stuff like, open and close a gate using a side chain as well. So a couple of things that you could do for some interesting results with side chains. So, all right, let me read through a couple of the questions here. All right, thanks everyone for great questions. Okay. All right. So we just have a question about how to apply offline processing on group channels and how to freeze the group. Is it possible? So again, we covered that a little bit earlier with the, just rendering it out. Okay. So we have a question on routing verb and compression on your way. So let's go ahead and just take a quick look at like some typical compression stuff and verb. So activate this project here.
Did you say you wished it all?
So like on this project, I tend, a lot of times, I'll do a lot of, I see people often kind of, abusing compressors a lot, and sometimes you may have situations like in this case, I kind of went through a lot of the breaths. So, you may have recordings that kind of sound like this, where the breaths will be very prominent. Like this is probably tracked through compression. So I've been known to kind of go through and, just kind of take the breaths and be able to, just kind of do clip-based automation. And I find it a lot of times that will, alleviate a lot of the need to do like multiple stages of compression. So once I kind of do some stuff like that, and it could take a minute or two to do, you could, have it sound very natural. And you want to leave just a little bit of breath in there. And sometimes I like to do that at this level because it kind of, before it hits any plugins, that way the compressor is not kind of, jacking up breaths. Some people, and I remember talking with Joachim van der Sog, is a well-known engineer, does like, Barbra Streisand records and stuff like that. And, that's a method that he uses a lot just to kind of do very quick, breath manipulation. Some people will also just kind of select, particular phrases in automation and say, I want to take, we'll take off your snap and say, okay, I just want to take that and drag that down. But that could be post inserts. So that may not be like, the best, gain stage to do that, but that's another method that you could do, is just kind of with the range selection tool, just be able to take different components. So I tend not to go too super heavy on compression. So let's see what I have like on this track here. I'll have just a little bit of the vintage compressor. And I'm a big proponent of, trying to use, for a lot of my projects, I find it could depend upon the project, but in a piece like this, I may try to have one reverb send or two. So when I go to my sends here, just going to my revelation. So I'll try to have, like a lot of devices go to the same room, so it sounds like it was all recorded and gives it a little bit of glue instead of like 6 different types of reverb. And this could come in handy, like maybe as drums come in, that the drums sound like they're in the same room as the singer and the piano. But, and I definitely kind of grew up in the 80s where everyone was trying to, create rooms that didn't exist and could, cut off, and gated reverbs and stuff. So I went through that whole production phase as well, which everyone had to at that time. But, I try to keep it pretty simple, and try to let the parts kind of speak for themselves. And it obviously depends on the actual part. But just a little bit of reverb and do sends and have multiple devices go to that, and not so heavy on compression, because try to fix it so that you don't have to try to make up for, issues like breaths and stuff directly on a file, so you don't have to do multiple stages of compression as well. So, but that's just, people get great results doing, lots of other things as well. Okay, so so I see a comment, and it says about an Elements 10 user here just reinstalled the program. All right, let me just. Okay, I'm just going to scroll up. I got switch my position here. Okay, sorry, just going to go through my. All right. Sorry, just navigating back to where I was. All right, lots of questions today. All right, so I'm just trying to scroll back to keep in order, but it's only going to allow me to go so far. So, okay, so All right, so we'll start at, sometimes I forget to turn on, let's see. Sometimes I forget to turn on my MIDI controller before turning on the DAW. So this may be with an older version of Cubase that you run into this. I think with version 8.5 or 9.5, one of them on a Windows platform, it would allow you to just connect the any MIDI controller directly to the to Cubase and would recognize it. So it could be, depending on earlier versions, I think it was 8.5 or 9.5 that was added to Cubase. Okay, so sorry, I think I lost some questions. We'll try to go through and see there's a zillion questions here. Okay, so the question is, how come Steinberg doesn't have a mobile app for AXR4? It would really come in handy when my computer is off and I need to mute channels. I think, if you have the AXR4T, because most mobile stuff isn't working over Thunderbolt. I haven't tried it with the USB version. I don't have one to actually check out. But that's why, because it's not necessarily working so much with, since it's not compatible with iOS devices. That's why you probably don't see a mobile application. Okay, so I see a question. Is there any way to add more options for track colors easily? It's tedious to add them one by one. So let's go to our project color setup. We'll take a look at this. So when we go to our project colors, I think if we go to options, let's say we go to our presets. We can say number of basic colors. We could say let's add 32. Number of color tints, we'll say 4. And now we do this. When we go to our color settings, that will be kind of our color palette to choose from. So again, once you go to the project color setup, at this point, just go to your presets and set the number of basic colors 32, 4, and you could have basic tints or basic colors. So whatever you want to. So that should be an easy way to get more color options available for you. Okay. So questions. Why am I sometimes hearing unwanted verb on my bus? Check to make sure that, I don't know a reason why it would do that, but it could be, check your sends and, you could see, maybe one is set to pre-fader. So if you wanted to, come here, you could say move to pre-fader, post-fader. So maybe it's one of those things that's going to be set up. All right. It's my son. Sorry. He wants some attention. All right. All right. Okay, so we'll go through some more questions. Okay, so we say, any tips on making a large template load faster, disable tracks into template? Yeah, that's a very easy way to do it. So, if you have a large scoring template, just simply come over here and disabling tracks. So if you just right click, that will do it. I've seen some people online also get to the point where we could choose it to not connected and then to connect it to the particular device. That can help quite a bit as well. But, try disabling tracks and, you could enable pretty quickly as soon as you're actually, working on that particular track. Okay, can you have very audio active in the lower zone? So yeah, so all you have to do is, once you double click, you can see, your editor here and just click on the very audio, and you could see all, and you may have to kind of zip around and kind of, since you don't have as much vertical space, but you could see your very audio active in the lower zone quite easily. All right. A way to increase or decrease zoom increments. So let's say if we go here, once you have, you could go basically to, nearly the sample level. So, a lot of people can zoom kind of this way. So that's a very fast way of moving the cursor in the timeline, and where you see it become like a 4-point compass, you could actually just zoom quickly that way. You could also zoom within the particular edit screens as well, and you could save kind of different zoom presets. So if you get to the point where you could just kind of click to the left here, you could have different presets and organize. So if you say, okay, I want to see 1 second, or I want to see milliseconds, or you could organize these as well. So, and also just knowing the key commands, like, for G and H, and being cognizant of those, and being cognizant that those can be independent depending upon the zone that you're in, can help. Okay. Okay, so question, is there any way to speed up my media bay loading and presets on channels? It is painful sometimes and really slows me down. I'm on Mac Mojave. My scanning preferences is set correctly. One preference to make sure that you have is, let's see if it's under media bay. You could have it kind of scan in the background, but some people make sure this preference isn't set up. And also, if you have, like a zillion, different drives, and maybe, family photos or something on a different drive, pick and choose which exact folders are, active within your computer. So that way it won't scan, different files, that will be, so when you go to your setup, you could not be looking in folders there. But once it kind of, and I see some people never let it go through a full scan, and every time it's kind of looking to scan. So, check those preferences. And if, make sure that you're not just searching in a bunch of folders that don't have any data. So you could, perhaps get rid of those, or tell it not to look in those particular folders by unchecking. All right. Can we create a new effects track from a preset? So let's give it a shot. So I'll just do a new project. And we'll add an effect track. Okay. And we will just come right over here, save as track preset. Okay, so we'll just come here. All right, I'll just make sure I didn't have a typo, but I'll try to save this as track preset again. So it doesn't look like it's doing it. I mean, I can see where you could probably, maybe if you had it as a group track, with an insert on it. Oh, here's our FX test. So let's just drag. I'll just get rid of these really quick. Sorry about this. So it doesn't look like it likes it as track presets. So I could see why, since the presets are stored, but I could play around with that some more. Okay, so it says about markers in mid window. Maybe it would be right just to be able to show the active marker track in the edit window. So yeah, I think that's probably what they would do if they implemented it. So, all right. Okay, so it says I get an error. Library manager has wrong version. Failed to establish privileged helper when installing Halion and Pad Shop libraries in newest versions of Library Manager. So I haven't seen that, but if you want to email me at gondo@yamaha.com, I could do some more research on that for you. We can see what it's maybe a little weird. But do you have the actual, just to make sure, this is about the content question we covered a little bit earlier with Howling and Pad Shop, but make sure that, just if you could indicate if you actually have Howling and Pad Shop working fine for you, and just maybe perhaps a library. Okay, so we have a question. Would I be able to test the behavior of the visibility tab? Takes 2 seconds. Sure. So I'll see if there's more details to come, but let's come here. I'll just add a number of audio tracks. Okay. And let me see if there's more to follow up. Okay, so a question. Okay, just going through. Okay, so we have a question. Hypersonic 2 not showing up in VST. What to do? It's probably a 32-bit plugin, and it's quite an old one. It's about, Hypersonic 2 at this point is 18 years old. So, it may not be working, and it hasn't been updated, and support for that is stopped about 15 years ago. So It's quite an older one, so a lot of the similar content you might find in Hallian Sonic. So I know some people, if you're running, may bridge it using JBridge, so that's worth a try. But it's not going to work for like the last three Cubase versions. Okay. Um, okay, so it says a long time ago you showed us how to replace a kick drum with a different audio kick. Can't seem to find that video. Could you show us again, please? Yeah. So I think it's on like a Q&A video. There's like a sample replacement or something like that. But let's say if I have this particular kick drum here and I wanted to replace it with another kick. So if you want to replace all the samples, really all you'd have to do is, let's say, so take just like another sample and drag it over while holding down the shift key. And if that sample has been used like multiple times, you'll get this message saying, do you want to modify all events that refer to the same audio material? Say all, and you've just replaced the kick drum for all of the events. So hold, once again, drag from Media Bay, hold down the shift key, drag it over, choose all, and all the samples will be replaced. Okay, so I see a question. How do I make the lower zone faders mimic the actual fader window? So once you're here, this is a different view of the same data. So if I wanted to see the same data with more capabilities in a different zone, but it's the same exact fader, so they do mimic each other. But maybe I'm misunderstanding the question, or I'll see it as we get lower. Okay, so this is getting back to the visibility questions. What I would like to test in the visibility tab in the mixer is shift click on a track or folder. There seems to be a bug that does not respond to visibility in the edit window. So let's go back to, this is kind of going back to where we were before. So let's say if I have this set up and let's say I'll just duplicate these tracks, get some more. Oh, I'll make this the active project first. Sorry. Okay, so let's say I have these tracks in a folder. Okay. Okay, so let's say if I just want to see all these, and now and let me see if I have my visibility. So I could say just yeah, so that seems to be working. One thing to be aware of is you could have, different visibilities in, this particular zone that's independent of the mixer, the full screen mixer views. So, think of this as like a fourth mixer. But these different zones could also, you could choose to not have it synced for, different visibility zones. So, but maybe I'll see more information further on. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so I'm just going through the questions. Thanks. Okay, how do you select all MIDI on one note in the MIDI or drum editor? So let's go ahead and add. I'll just do this in a drum editor. It might be easier. All right, so in the drum editor, I think if you hold down Shift and double click, that will select all of the notes from that point. I think if you also just, so you could just simply Shift double click, and I think if we kind of do something similar in the key editor, let me just toggle this over. So yeah, just Shift and double click, and that will select all the notes at the same pitch. Okay, so we had a question on like mix console snapshot faders. So as soon as we come over here, let's say we have our mix console set up. All right, and let's say if I have a couple inserts. Okay, so now at this point, I have my faders set. We could take a snapshot. And so I move all my faders here. Let's say something different. I could take a snapshot. And now we could just navigate back and forth between snapshot 1 and snapshot 2. Now, this could also just mimic not only, let's say we go to snapshot, this snapshot. I moved these inserts around here to different tracks. I could take a snapshot. And you can have up to 8 snapshots, and they're going to be recalled directly within the mix console. So if I do this, we could now see our inserts, and I recall snapshot 2. Our inserts would be different to go back. And you'll see this mix console snapshot recall setting. So you could choose to recall like the preset section, inserts, EQ, channel strip, sends, pan, volume, and you could also choose to do before only on selected channels. So you could say I wanted to recall all the EQs from snapshot 2, the volumes from snapshot 3, and the inserts from snapshot one on the selected channels. So you can just kind of see it directly here. And if you're in the full mix console view, you can see kind of your snapshots that you could recall here, but the same kind of functionality. So that's kind of a quick overview on how the mix console snapshots will work. Okay, so just seeing a question, changing from Studio One form. A question is, when I'm recording vocals, how do I stop the boxy sound coming from Cubase? It's not happening in Studio One, so I definitely need help. If you had the same hardware, it should sound pretty close. It could be when you're saying a boxy sound, maybe you're running into monitoring issues. So if you go to your studio menu to studio setup, make sure that you go to your VST audio system, right, and that you're using the ASIO driver for your audio interface, and try to make sure that you have direct monitoring checked. You may be hearing, depending on your audio interface, you may be hearing the delay come back depending on the routing. But again, try to make sure that, if you have direct monitoring checked, and you may also set that up within your audio interface, but, check to make sure direct monitoring, and that, you may hear like a weird delay. So, okay, so we have a question about explaining about reconforming. So what reconforming will allow you to do is, if someone has done a picture change, let's say they've given you a video to do the score to, and all of a sudden they do different picture changes, or they edit it out, 6 seconds here, added 4 seconds there, 3 seconds here, and had picture edits, which is kind of inevitable. What reconforming software would allow you to do is to have all of your projects automatically conform to that edit decision list that's going to be generated by the video program. So Cubase doesn't have reconforming, but Nuendo, kind of our advanced media production system, that's one of the distinctions that Nuendo has over Cubase, and it's really not necessarily for composition, but more post-production stuff. Whereas we're reconforming, which is why it's kind of a Nuendo specific kind of tool. Okay. Okay, so let's go through. Thanks for all the great questions from people. So I see a question. Is there a way to make different tracks use the same CC channel so I don't have to copy and paste all the time? So I'm not sure if maybe if you could ask that question our way. Is it for like an audio track, or is it a MIDI track that you're writing MIDI continuous controllers in? Okay, so maybe if you could specify, we'll see if we can circle back to that. How to convert MIDI instruments to wave track. So if you have different MIDI parts here, there's a number of ways. We saw that we could do the export audio mix down. One easy way to do this is, if we have a project, is using the render in place functionality. Gives you a lot of different options for including effects, excluding effects. So we'll show you what we could do with this. So if I have, let's say, and the render in place we could do for multiple parts. So if I have my piano part here, we could just go to your edit and just choose render in place, and you could have render settings that will be set up. So here I could say, okay, I wanted to, have my channel settings. I wanted to include my sends or my master effects. We could have a custom name. We could choose a different path. So, if I wanted to do this for multiple parts, I could actually just take, I'll just close this, and let's just say I have, these parts here. I'll select. And if I want, I could we'll just render between the left and right locators here. So I'll just select those three parts. And I see people always wanting like a multi-freeze, which is kind of, I would just say render and play. So I would just say render with current settings. And you could choose to automatically just kind of take the different sections of the song and just render that as audio and have the other events muted if you wanted to. So, check out, you could do an export audio mix down, you could freeze, but really, check out the different, from the edit menu, the render in place options, because it gives you a lot of great capabilities. Yeah, and another comment that someone made, if it's like you want to render in place, another, clever workaround some people do is you have the sampler track. You could just drag and drop right into the sampler track, and that would render it there as well. And that would go into the sampler folder. You could drop it into your project as you see fit. So question, is there any way to control the transport bar remotely? Thanks from Buenos Aires. So yeah, I mean, there's a number of different functions that, we have the Cubase IC Pro. I know people that do, wireless, there's some wireless controls. I think Frontier Design had one at one point. There's a number of those, people just having a wireless keyboard. Like if you're going to another, part of the room or to a studio, some of those have quite long ranges. So you could do that. But also check out the Cubase IC Pro app if you have an iPad. That's a great solution. All right. All right, let's keep going. We have lots of questions. Okay. Thanks to everyone's patience. Okay, so question is, can you quickly explain an easy way for you to send drum tracks to a separate bus and explain the channel path they would take? I have to send them pre-fader to stop them picking up the effects. So let's jump back to. Okay, so if I now want to come here, we could just say, I could select these particular tracks in my mix console, and I could choose to add a group channel to the selected channels, and we'll add a stereo group. And now all of my different information will be summed here. So this is sending the sum of all the audio to here. And this is handy for when you want to, perhaps we'll take this particular channel and I want to take all the drums or all the background vocals and put a little bit of EQ or a little bit of compression on it. So just kind of smooth it out a little bit. So we could do that very easily and kind of change the sound. Now, if we have automation that's kind of, going up and down in different motions, when we bring the group, that can also, as we drop this, that could affect your gain structure of the audio going into sends. So here's where Another technique is useful where we could add a VCA fader to the selected channels. And now if my fader is kind of, going up and some are going down, if I drag this would affect the gain structure of my drums going to their sends. But if I do this, we could just have, automation going on in contrary motion, but I could use a VCA fader, which wouldn't affect the gain structure to the sends. So there's times when you may want to use groups for doing parallel processing and you want to increase or decrease volumes overall by using a VCA fader. So if you're running into picking up the other effects, you may want to investigate using VCA faders. Okay, thanks for all the great questions. So is there a way to use Logical Editor to generate random notes in the piano roll using a specified scale? It won't generate the notes, but if you have, let's say, a MIDI track here, and let's say I did my 21st century composition technique here. All right. So now you could have these, within the logical editor, conform to a scale. So we could say value 1. Let's see, transpose to scale, and let's make it a D major. Now I could just hit apply, and now all those notes would be within D major or E major accordingly. So the logical editor won't generate the notes, but you could kind of generate it easily switching the line tool to the paint tool and then doing it. So it's kind of a two-step process. Okay. So, and this may be part of the previous question. Is there a way to make different tracks use the same CC channel? So when you, if you put multiple tracks, let's say, if I duplicated this particular track and maybe this is, and, understand, maybe if it's English isn't first language, because I'm terrible at other languages. So it's, and I put all of these tracks into record and move, my mod wheel here. So if I come here and, that will record my modulation or MIDI CC data that I'm just moving knobs on there. So, I'm not sure if that's the question, but, let me know if we get a chance to go through and cover that again. So if I'm probably misunderstanding. Okay, so we had a question. I often have problems with expression maps automatically switching to the channel's default articulation rather than what I've drawn in. Is this a MIDI chase issue or something? I had that with some earlier versions where it would do that, and I would, make sure that when you do write in, any articulations that you have, in the expression editor, that it starts right at the very beginning. So see if that could be it and if that makes a difference. But I know some expression maps are kind of set up to make sure that the very first expression isn't, like is kind of like a dummy empty slot. So we have a question. I don't hear the click on the first bar. It could be under metronome. So let's go to your transport to your metronome setup. So it could be maybe click during count in one of these options, and the click options isn't checked. So I would kind of look there. Okay. Any way to quantize audio in Elements 10.5, even with a plugin? Only thing missing for me in this package. I don't think a plugin is going to do that. So some of the functionality just isn't in the $99 version. So think of maybe upgrading to the artist version. So. Okay, so hi Greg, thanks for all the great presentation. Lots of VST effects won't light up in my tracks. Is this a known issue for Cubase? So when you say light up in my tracks, is that being that maybe they're blacklisted? So oftentimes when plugins get blacklisted, you can go to your studio menu to your plugin manager. So I thought it was there. Maybe it's under more options. Okay, our VST plugin manager. And make sure that they're not, if you're saying it doesn't light up, I'm not sure if it's not illuminating or if it's not visible. So, and a lot of times when plugins are blacklisted, it's because they're deemed to be, they kind of failed a diagnostic test and they could be unstable. So if you go to the VST plugin manager, you can often unblacklist them, but that could be kind of running at your own risk. And is blacklisted for a reason. Okay. Okay. Okay, so see, Greg, how can I render a track to eliminate the insert plugins but retain for the new track the original output bus and then have the original sends? This is to reduce CPU by eliminating insert plugins. Okay, so if we have a situation like that where we have a number of inserts on a track and you want it to kind of maintain the same channel routing and configurations. So let's say if I go to this particular track, I'll select, let's say, my snare track here. And let's say for its inserts, I want to have, different dynamics processing. We'll just throw a bunch of stuff on, a reverb, whatever I want. Let's put in a filter. So I have a number of, just anonymous plugins, and I wanted it to be applied to a particular track, let's say my snare track. One thing you could do is if you go to the direct offline processing, you could just drag the entire insert chain right there, and that will render that file for you, and then just simply bypass your inserts. And now that will play as if all of those, your insert chain has now been processed, and you could take those all on and off, or take them, tweak it a little bit and just change the settings, and now that will just render it. The original file is always intact, and you could access that just by saying delete all and then just turning on your inserts again. So play around with some of the direct offline processing as an option. Okay, so going through some more questions. Okay, so it says, hello, how can I keep my pool record folders unique to each new project folder created from a project template without doing it manually? So, the pool is a reference to all of the different, media that's been recorded into the system. So I see a lot of people will build a template based on a project that references audio files already. So if you do that, start your template and make sure that when you start the template that it has no audio files as it's in the template, because those files will always be referenced, because generally the pool will only be used, the files you see in the pool are only going to be used in the project. And a quick way of doing that is, you could save your new project and just say removed unused media, and that will kind of, get rid of the pool, the media that's in the pool that's not being used. But basically the pool will be unique for each project. But many people starting off from a template have the template loading up audio in a pool. So make sure you get rid of that, and that should do the trick. All right. Okay, so I see a question from Bernie about the Blacklist plugin. So we mentioned that. And it's good to see you on a Hangout, Bernie. Is it just wondering how perhaps it is for Cubase performance? And again, a lot of times some of those plugins are blacklisted for a reason. You could try to run them. Some of them, may be fine for different aspects of your work. But just be aware that if stuff starts to misbehave, that's a good place to look. So maybe try one plugin at a time and see what impact it makes on your system. Now, I know you've had some issues, Bernie, with your video cards that you got sorted out, so I'm glad to hear that. So hope you're doing great, and congratulations on your CD. So question, is that paintbrush thing in the edit window in Artist? I believe it is. I think it's even in Elements and AI. It's just kind of a nice little hidden gem. Okay, can I ask, when is Cubase not going to need a dongle? They're always looking and, working on new licensing methods. And I can tell you that after redoing my whole computer, I kind of like the dongle recently. So I know that they're working on something. I don't anticipate it being months away. So, it's a pretty daunting process, for the company to do and to make sure that the transition makes sense. So, but it is being investigated and looked into. I can't really give you a time frame. Okay, so we had a question. How do you mute an instrument track that's playing an arpeggio without losing sync with other tracks when you unmute it? So let's go ahead and see if we could get this scenario here. Okay, let me just find a quick. Okay, and I'll duplicate this track really quickly and put it to a different sound. Okay, so let's say we'll have. Okay, and okay, so I'm just going to reread the question. Now I kind of have a scenario set up. So how do you mute an instrument track that's playing an arpeggiator without losing sync with the other track when you unmute it? So it seems pretty in sync. Now, if you do run into issues, you could also just kind of come over here. I'm not sure if you're dead set on doing it live for like a performance element, but if you also come here and just say like freeze MIDI modifiers on this here, you should be able to see, that could write, or you could just simply choose to, like as we go to a particular track, just hit the record, and then you could have that data, recorded directly into, as I would play a chord. So as I would just kind of come here and then you could mute different parts. But if and you could also, just do mute automation for different elements. So if you wanted to, you could just click on the mute and just, if you want to be like really precise about different stuff. So you could say, let's say show automation, and then you could just, see the mute automation here. So, and be able to kind of draw that in. But I'll play around with it a little more if you're running into issues. But make sure that when you're doing it, that you're actually muting it on time. So, okay. Okay, difference between effects and group channels. They're really functionally the same now. It used to be that the group channels you couldn't pan independently, but they're really functionally the same. So there's not a huge amount of difference between them. So I believe that they both allow you to do routing. People would get very kind of angry about that for some reason before. So it's always an interesting distinction. So. Okay, going through different comments. So we have a question: is Cubase Pro better than Studio One? Because I'm reading the comments and nothing propel me to buy a license. Laughing out loud. So yeah, it is better. So there's a lot more different aspects, and I think you'll find it to be a much more mature program. So okay. Okay, so question about switching between piano roll and drum diamonds in the lower zone, like if that's possible. If you just click here in the editor, you could just look at that in the drum editor or score editor. Yeah, so you could choose between the three different editors. Okay, so see, question: is there a chance for classic machines from Cubase in Cubase? I think a lot of those algorithms and functions are already inside, and the content is already inside of Cubase. So I'm not sure if it needs to be added. It may not be labeled as such. Okay. So question on how to master a cappella. Sorry for bad English. So for any audio source, there's a lot of great things that you could do. Especially a cappella stuff. One thing that could be really handy, especially if you have vocals that aren't necessarily lined up in time. So make sure if you have separate tracks that you can do like the very audio pitch shifting. Like I was just working on a project this afternoon and just pitch shifting, doing pitch correction made the vocals all sit better. Some other tips you may run into is you may run into situations where rhythmically something isn't as tight as you would like.
Somos iguales. Somos iguales.
So in a situation like that, you may want to select one file and work on audio alignment. So here we could say, this is my reference track, and I want to select these, and we could select multiple tracks as a target. At that point, we could just choose to align the audio, and rhythmically, we could just tighten up some different elements.
Somos iguales.
All right. And my son is trying to invade the room again. Apologize. He's getting a little restless. Okay, so I think those are some good tips for working on, a cappella stuff that could help. So, work on pitch correction and the rhythmic timing, and that can make a big, difference in the overall how the tracks will sit together. Okay, so Okay, so we have a question. Is there a reasonable way to import a .all format file into modern Cubase? I don't have access to older license that will allow me to bridge the gap. Just a convert tool would be great. There isn't a conversion tool, and at this point it's going back, 20 years. But your whatever license you have, so like your Cubase 10 license, your 10.5 license will run previous versions, and you can download SX or SL3 still. And I realize that it may not work on all the latest operating systems, but that is still available as a free download, and your license for later versions will work with it. So at that point, you could just simply install that on a Mac or PC in an older computer, connect your USB-E licenser, and open the file and save it as a .cpr file. But there isn't just a standalone conversion utility. And I understand why that would be handy, but they're just how it is. Okay, how do you transfer a project from Cubase 10 Pro to Cubase Pro 10.5? There's no transfer that's actually needed. All you have to do is just simply open it up. Okay. I want to buy Cubasis when it supports exporting projects to Cubase. There is a Cubase, the projects do transfer over. So there's like a little utility that will automatically allow you to import it into Cubase, so you could enjoy your Cubasis. Okay, so it says, you guys, can I use one dongle and network with extra USB via network program so you never unplug it? I've never tried that. Maybe some other people can comment, but it's not really designed for that. Okay, going through some of the questions. Thanks for all the great questions, everyone. Hope everyone's learning a tip or trick or two. Okay, so a question from about, is it possible to drag and drop wave from project to some library and drag it back from it to project, just like that, drag and drop? Cubase or Nuendo? Cubase has great capabilities already of just dragging and dropping. Many of the instruments like Groove Agent SE or Halion can automatically just drag and drop different content quite easily. So if we have, let's say, our Halion opened up, we could just kind of come over here back to our media bay. And if we wanted to, drag a sample right in, we could do that quite easily, and we could drag elements out. But, where some people run into issues is not all the plugins have that support. It's not necessarily a Cubase limitation, but it'll be more often in drag and drop, aren't being designed in the plugin itself. Okay, so getting back to our multiple, about our MIDI CCs, I think we're kind of where we are. Where the question is, can you edit CC events from multiple parts in a single key editor? It's a little tricky, to be fair. I think we'll see some changes for this coming. But if we have, let's say if I have this, and let's say if I have a couple tracks of my pad shop here. And let's say I wanted to draw in modulation. I think if we copy, we'll give this a try, see the behavior's changed. So, depending where you're at, you can kind of cut, copy, and paste to see the different information, but there isn't a way currently to edit the same, edit the modulation in different. So, see if we select the three of them, and we'll select our modulation here. That you could just kind of choose to edit your controllers here. So say you edit that, but you could switch back and forth, but no way to write the same controller data to multiple parts currently. So I think that we might be seeing. I know there's been some discussions on that. Okay, how do you snap a sync point to the cursor? So a sync point, if you're not familiar with it, I'll just... So let's say if I just come here and... So, when you go into the sample editor, you could have what's called a sync point, and this will actually allow you to move like a particular, let me just come here. So we see this little S, and this S can be moved within the editor because you may have let's say a pickup note, and this sync point is kind of what now snaps. Instead of snapping the beginning of the event will snap based on this sync point. And if we want it to, if I come here, let's say we go to the edit menu, then we could say, move to cursor. At that point, it's not based on the actual. So if I move my cursor here, it's not going to be the start of the event, but the sync point. So go to edit menu, move to cursor, or Command L, and then that point will snap directly to the cursor. Okay. Okay, so I see maybe it's a feature request, but the generic remote to control room level. Let's just take a quick look. So we'll get to our studio setup and let's add a generic remote. Okay, so it looks like if we wanted to do generic remote to the control room level, we can say, okay, fader 1, under device, choose VST control room, then control room under channel category, and under the value action, choose volume. So I think that will allow you to use the generic remote for the control room volume. Okay. Okay, so I see a question on when will the import and convert problem from 10.5 update be fixed? I'm not aware of that. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but maybe if you could uh, expand, if it is it a sample rate conversion, a bit rate conversion, because I've done a number of them recently and haven't had any issues. So. Okay. So question is the tape saturation is a tape saturation available outside the strip? I'm wondering if there's a plug-in version with more controls and what exactly comes with the what does exactly does AG auto gain do, or do I notice a tone difference as well? So the auto gain will kind of make sure that as you're playing with it that it doesn't necessarily boost the gain. It'll kind of be optimized, but you could find saturation plugins. So if we go to and they may be under distortion, so you could see magneto directly here. So and that's a great tape saturation plugin. That was the very first tape saturation plugin. So they are available with some additional controls here. So look under magneto and I'll just check, see what the other ones are, but most of the channel strip do have full capability. So if you're going to do tape saturation, tube saturation. So at this point, we could, under distortion, let's just see if there's, but I can see, let me just see if there's, and that may be coming from the tube. For the tube saturation, but yeah, definitely play with the magneto under distortion, and that'll give you a lot of great options. Okay, so we had a question about the multi-band compressor. Okay, so we'll just come under here to dynamics and our multi-band compressor. So here you could see, some of the different controls. So with your ratio, your knee settings. Okay. And then so I don't think it does auto makeup gain. So, and kind of the concept of a multi-band compressor is to compress individual frequency ranges. So if I wanted to expand or compress, different frequencies for different purposes, we could have different dynamics control for different frequency ranges. So there's also different side chaining. So if you wanted to side chain different bands, you could activate which bands are visible on side chaining as well. So you could just kind of come here. You're going to have your threshold, your ratio. You may not see like a soft knee, hard knee setting, and generally in a lot of multi-band compressors, you won't see that, but you have your tack release. And again, you could set your frequency for different side chaining functionality right there as well. So, play around with a lot of the presets as well, but it's a pretty standard compressor settings, and I think you get some great results out of it. Okay, so there's some discussion about the dongles. Says I wish they switched dongles to iLock. Their dongle is too long and breakable. The newer dongles are much shorter, so I think you'll find them a bit more resilient. And some of the iLock technology doesn't has some of its own issues that we don't have in the e-licenser world. Okay. Okay, so a question about making the compressors like dual mono capable. I think Chris had posted a tutorial on this, but if you have a compressor, you could just simply, one of the things you could do, let's say if we have it on a stereo channel, what I've seen some people do, I think this is the trick they do, is let's say they're going for a, or standard compressor or whatever, and they're crunching it. But if we go to, um, let's say if you go to, it might be under the channel strip here, where you could do your inserts and do the insert routing, that, you may want to just choose to come here and you could say, I want that to be mono, and you could open up the routing editor to see, which left and right channel. So you could use two different compressors, one set for left channel, one for right channel. So I know some people that do that as well to do like a dual mono setup. So. Okay, question: is there a routing editor in Cubase's control room as it is in Nuendo? Thank you. I think the control room, maybe this is referring to the control room overview that used to be in, inside of, you'd see it in the studio menu in previous versions. It didn't really allow you to edit, I don't think. It was just kind of a visual representation, almost like a signal flow diagram. So it was kind of taken away. It's just in the manual now, but I don't think you could actually edit it. Rather than it was just kind of give you an overview of signal flow. Okay. Okay, thanks again for all the great questions. Okay, so in the mixing window, how can I hide the delay compensation? Is that probably, let's take a quick look. I think it's maybe the latency monitor. So if we go to our mix console here, and if you go to the channel settings, I think it's maybe the channel latency monitor. So if you go in the mix console, you'll see the Windows layout, enable that. And then I think this is where it could show you the latency on every single channel. Just uncheck from the window layout options. Okay, just going through some of the questions. Okay, we have a question. How would you time warp to speed up a song? You don't have to time warp to speed up a song. Really, just any audio file that you've dragged in. Let's say if I have, this particular drum loop going on, I'll just drag a drum loop in a new project here. So say I just have this loop, I drop it in here. Once a loop is in musical mode, so let's say we just have this going on. So once it's in musical mode and there's a bar beat correlation, it'll now just follow whatever tempo you have. So if I speed up my tempo, so you don't have to do any like goofy, setting up warp markers and stuff like that. Just put it into musical mode, change the tempo, and it will lock to the tempo. Okay, just kind of going through some of the comments and questions. So we have a question: is there an easier way to convert .fxb bank files to VST presets for third-party plugs rather than do them one at a time? There isn't kind of a mass way to do it, but it's, for most of the plugins, I mean, I think that came in Cubase 4, which was 2006. So, when we came out the VST3 plugin, so, it's been 6.5 versions to kind of do it. So while not everyone is updated their plugins, you just kind of can do it one time. I don't even think I have any VST plugins that have FXB or FXP files anymore. Okay. Okay, so I see a question or a comment, how about time warp? We did discuss that a bit earlier with tempo handling. I see a question. Do I know Kip Williams? I think he's friends with maybe one of my friends, Carlos, in Richmond. Carlos Chafin. All right. Okay, so we have a question. How do you write sections of the song in bookmarks and be able to see them when jumping from point to point in a project? So I use the arranger track, is really handy for this. So let's say if I jump back to this project here, marker tracks are also very handy to do, and you could kind of pin the marker track to the top. And, if you wanted to label markers, you could come here and say, intro, verse 1, etc. And you could see those, in the name of the markers. Another way you could do this is adding and using the arranger track. You don't necessarily have to use it for its intended functionality, but you could say, I just want this to be intro, verse, and then these could be labeled, and just hold down the Option key, I think. And that way you could always kind of have those on top, and you could color them also as you see fit. So if you wanted to make that event, more reddish or whatever, you could do that. So you could change. So that's a good way to kind of have your project structure of your song set up. Okay. Okay, so it says question. I have how to add a real time effect like reverb while recording a vocal. It could one thing that can confuse people sometimes when you're doing this is if you're set up to do direct monitoring on your audio interface, that you probably won't hear effects. So if you have like one of the Steinberg UR series, some of the interfaces will have built-in effects that you could access internally, like reverb. If you have it not set to direct monitoring at this point, so direct monitoring will basically take the input signal and pass it directly to the output. So that will basically bypass any of the software effects and plugins. So that would bypass it. But if you don't have direct monitoring on and you just have an audio track and you have it send, set up to monitor through, the reverb, at that point you'll hear the reverb, but there could be some delays. So, some of the effect interfaces like the Steinberg UR series will have the built-in DSP so you can have the reverb with no delays. All right, next question. Have I heard of any issues of Cubase 10.5 crashing? I keep crashing every time it gets to VST2 plugins. When I remove all the plugins, it works, but when I put them back, it doesn't. So it's, that's pretty indicative that there's a plugin that's causing problems, and you may just have to isolate it. If you hold down, Alt Control Shift or Command Option Shift, you could start the program without it. And, it's, sometimes plugins that haven't been updated will do that. And that's, one of the reasons that we do the plugin blacklisting. Okay, so we have a question. I have a question. Who sings the song Uninvited in a video? How to sell an effects channel track. I think the singer's name is Andrea. It's a song that my friend Vince Melamed has given me for a demo. He was like a well-known songwriter in Nashville for a long time, and he's toured with, and played with, a bunch of people, Bob Dylan. He's, toured with the Eagles, back in, he was on Eagles Live back in Hotel California days. So he's kind of a great songwriter. So I think it's someone he collaborated with. But yeah, she's a great singer. So I love kind of working on his projects and using them for demos. He's very generous in allowing me to use some of his projects. So kudos to Vince Melamed. Look him up. Great songwriter, performer. Okay. Okay, so we have a comment. Will Cubase ever make the mix console knobs properly colored again, like how it was in version 8, leaving them all gray? Now just isn't as easy as it was finding a bunch of the same knobs. I'll pass on that comment to kind of our product planning. Sometimes they try to make sure that the colors aren't distracting and that you could look at it, and they do a lot of research on what colors you could look at for really long periods of time. So there's, different functionality for that as well. All right. So, but I'll pass on your comment. Next comment we have, I have a UR44 interface. Can I set up separate monitor and headphone settings in the control room? So once you have, the Q mix defined here, like in your project, you could have multiple Q mixes. you could have, different volumes set. So if I wanted to come directly, then we could do this in a large kind of format console here. So if I go to my cues, and we can make sure that on the racks that we have cue sends turned on, and here you could set, your different volume levels to cues. And a common thing that you may run into is people wanting like a more me headphone mix. Let's just jump to this project. Could show this pretty well. So if the drummer wanted different headphone mixes than the rest of the ensemble, at this point we could select all the drums, and let's go to our cue mix here. And I will just make sure we have quick link turned on, and then you could set different volume and panning information that the drummer would hear in their headphone mix as well. So okay, I see a question: when is Steinberg going to release a Cubase 1 version for all? Not sure what exactly, if that's one version for iOS or Cubase, or so, different levels. We like to have different people, different price points be able to get into Cubase. All right, so we've gone about 3 hours. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. One of these things, we know that a lot of people are doing the social distancing thing. It seems to be in vogue these days. So if you wanted to do another hangout this week, maybe on Friday, I know we have a bunch of topics that we didn't get to. But if someone wants to, if we want to do this again on Friday, we could do this a couple of times a week, because we know a lot of people are going to be doing stuff, or could be home more. A lot of musicians, that aren't touring now will be doing more studio stuff and spending more time with their Cubase. So let me know in the comments field, and we'll go ahead and wrap up. My son's been very patient, so I will go take him out for a little walk around the neighborhood. So, but I appreciate everyone's patience and putting up with some of the distractions that we heard. But I just want to thank everyone for participating in the hangout. It was a wonderful turnout. If you want to do another hangout, we can maybe schedule one for Friday afternoon, and we could try to do 2 a week. We could do more, less if necessary. Just let us know what you want to do. We want to sit here and help you, experience more of your Cubase. I hope that everyone has learned a couple of tips and tricks, and with the current health situation, I hope that everyone stays healthy and is doing well, and your families and loved ones are all okay. So with that, I'll go ahead and end the hangout, but just let me know in the comments field if you want to do another hangout in the next couple of days, and we will get that set up perhaps on Friday at the same time. So thanks again, and let us know what you want to do if you want another one in the next couple of days. Thank you very much, and have a great day.